Close your eyes for a moment
and
and
imagine
imagine
a
it.
place the world
A
isn't
private
allowed
Mediterranean island so heavily fortified it doesn't
Where money
appear
is
on any
limitless
satellite map that you
and
or I
power
could ever
is
access.
absolute.
Fleets of matte black
At
supercars
the
lined
center
up
of it
along
all,
a white marble
A
promenade.
man they call
Stacks of uncounted cash sitting
lion.
casually on antique desks.
And beside
Not
him,
because anyone needs to count it,
the woman
but because the man who
who would
owns it
change
simply doesn't
everything.
care to. Vintage champagne flowing
in a
from
room
3-tier
like this,
crystal fountains.
not everyone is here to
and a
celebrate.
security detail armed with
Perfection is
weapons
a
that most
lie.
sovereign nations could only dream of.
And in just
At the center of this world
3
stands
seconds,
one man,
everything
draped
changed.
in a custom Italian tuxedo that cost
sorry.
more than most people's homes. His jaw is set like granite. His eyes move across every room like a predator calculating exits. Beside him, breathtaking, luminous, flawless, is his fiancée. Yet $100 million diamond blazes on her finger, throwing fractured light across a ballroom full of the world's most dangerous and powerful people. Cartel heads, corrupt politicians, syndicate royalty. They are all here, all smiling, all raising their crystal flutes to toast the most powerful couple in the criminal underworld. This is the engagement party of the century. And then, in less time than it takes you to blink, it is all completely, catastrophically, and irreversibly destroyed. What happened inside that ballroom? Stay right here, because you are not going to believe a single second of it. Welcome back to Hidden Mafia Chronicles, the only channel that dares to pull back the velvet ropes, reach past the armed guards, and expose the most dangerous, most classified, most explosive secrets that the criminal elite fight tooth and nail to keep buried forever. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because what we cover on this channel is not the kind of content you stumble across twice. Now, let's talk about tonight's story. Every few decades, the criminal underworld produces a figure so calculating, so ruthless, and so strategically brilliant that even the most hardened syndicates fall respectfully, or fearfully, silent when his name is mentioned. Tonight's central figure is one of those men. His name is Lorenzo Rossi. But in every boardroom, back alley, and fortified compound, from Naples to Cartagena, he is known by only one name: the Lion. And that name is not a courtesy. It is a warning. Lorenzo Rossi is not a crime boss in the traditional sense, the kind you picture hunched over a card table in a smoky basement somewhere, counting dirty money. No, Lorenzo operates on an entirely different level. By day, he is a legitimate billionaire, a name that graces the covers of elite international wealth magazines, a man photographed shaking hands with prime ministers, a figure whose charitable foundations have built hospitals and funded universities across 3 continents. His public persona is immaculate, almost impossibly so, but underneath every pressed tuxedo, every curated press release, and every philanthropic photo opportunity, Lorenzo the Lion Rossi controls one of the most expansive, most sophisticated, and most ruthlessly efficient criminal syndicates in the modern world. Global shipping routes, underground arms distribution, back-channel political influence on 4 continents. If illicit power has a nerve center, Lorenzo's fingerprints are all over it. And for years, decades even, he has remained completely, almost supernaturally untouchable. Now, every lion, no matter how powerful, eventually decides he needs a queen. Enter Isabella Vance. If you travel in elite high society circles, and the odds are, if you are watching this channel, someone in your life does, you already know the name. Isabella Vance is a globally recognized figure, a supermodel, a socialite, a philanthropist in her own right, and the heir to one of the most storied and politically connected families in European high society. She has graced the covers of the world's most prestigious fashion publications. She has dined with royalty. I testified before international trade committees and managed her family's vast portfolio of legitimate enterprises with an iron grip wrapped in a velvet glove. To the outside world, Isabella Vance is the definition of grace, beauty, and refined power. But as we are about to learn, in this story, things are almost never what they appear to be. When Lorenzo announced their engagement, the criminal world held its collective breath. Because everyone, every cartel head, every syndicate underboss, every corrupt official on Lorenzo's payroll, understood exactly what this union represented. This was not romance. This was architecture. The Vance family's deep-water Mediterranean ports, their ironclad political relationships, she and their centuries-old network of legitimate business influence were precisely the missing pieces Lorenzo needed to make his syndicate not just powerful, but globally, permanently, untouchably dominant. He wasn't buying a bride, he was buying an empire, and he was sealing the deal with $100 million ring. The engagement party was planned for his private island, multi-billion-dollar in scale. The guest list read like a who's who of the world's most dangerous and influential figures, and by every external measure, it was going to be the crowning jewel of Lorenzo the Lion, Rossi's already extraordinary legacy. It lasted exactly 3 seconds before it all came violently apart. Stay with me, because we are going to walk through every single moment of that night. And by the time we are done, you are going to understand exactly how the most powerful man in the criminal underworld lost everything to the one person he never saw coming. The Mediterranean breeze carried the scent of millions of imported white orchids that lined every wall of the grand ballroom. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos circulated with trays of chilled beluga caviar and crystal flutes of champagne that cost more than a luxury sports car. Every surface gleamed. Every detail was deliberate. Every guest had been hand-picked, vetted, and searched 3 times before their feet ever touched the marble floor. And at the center of it all, Lorenzo and Isabella, gliding across the floor with a kind of predatory elegance that made the room instinctively part around them. To every camera, every watching eye, every raised glass, they looked hopelessly, enviably, perfectly in love. But here is the dark truth you need to understand about Lorenzo the Lion Rossi. He doesn't do romance. He does business. Just 6 months before this night, Lorenzo orchestrated one of the most ruthless power grabs in modern syndicate history, a hostile takeover of the entire eastern seaboard's underground shipping lanes. 3 rival families. One night. Coordinated strikes so precise and so merciless that by sunrise, there was nothing left to negotiate with. Lorenzo didn't send a message that night. He erased the conversation entirely. This engagement was never a fairy tale. It was a corporate merger with a diamond on top. Isabella's family brought 2 things Lorenzo couldn't buy outright: generational political influence that ran so deep it touched the highest levels of 3 European governments, and a network of deep-water Mediterranean ports that would make his syndicate's global distribution completely, permanently untouchable. He wasn't falling in love. He was closing the most important acquisition of his career, and the ring on Isabella's finger was nothing more than a very expensive contract. Back in the ballroom, the illusion held. But if you knew what you were looking for, and tonight, someone absolutely did, the cracks were already beginning to show. It started small. By the towering champagne fountain, 2 rival syndicate underbosses stood close together, their crystal flutes raised in the pretense of casual conversation. But their smiles never reached their eyes. Their voices were low and clipped, and beneath the pleasantries something venomous was moving between them. An argument without raised voices. A threat wrapped in a toast. Then there was Isabella. While Lorenzo was across the room accepting the hollow admiration of a corrupt senator, Isabella slipped quietly to the edge of the ballroom. She stopped in front of a gilded mirror, the kind of enormous, gold-framed piece that exists purely to remind everyone in the room how magnificent the room is. For just a moment, she checked her reflection. And that is when it happened. The camera-ready smile disappeared. Completely, like a light switched off. Her chest rose and fell with a breath that was just slightly too controlled, the kind of breathing a person practices when they are managing something enormous beneath the surface. She reached up to adjust a stray lock of hair, and her hand, the one carrying that stone, was visibly, unmistakably trembling. She glanced at her diamond-encrusted watch, then her eyes moved, sharp, deliberate, to the ballroom's massive oak doors. She was waiting for something. But the most chilling detail of the entire evening wasn't Isabella's trembling hand or the venom between the underbosses by the fountain. It was a waiter. Standing near the VIP tables, silver tray in hand, tuxedo pressed and immaculate. Except that it fit just a little too tightly across the shoulders. The kind of tightly that happens when a man built for combat is forced into formal wear. He wasn't watching the guests. He was watching the security cameras. Slowly, methodically, cataloging every blind spot in the room with the practiced patience of someone who had done this kind of work many times before. His earpiece was almost invisible. Almost. And on his knuckles, in just below the white cuff of his tuxedo sleeve. Heavy, raised, brutally scarred calluses, the kind that only come from years of disciplined professional violence. He wasn't serving hors d'oeuvres. He was working. The trap was fully set. The room was full. The champagne was flowing. Lorenzo the Lion Rossi stood at the center of his empire, a velvet box in his tuxedo pocket, and absolute confidence in his eyes. And the countdown to the single most catastrophic 3 seconds of his life had already begun. Lorenzo raised his crystal flute. The room responded instantly, the hum of 100 private conversations fading to silence, the clink of glasses being set down, the rustle of evening wear as every guest turned to face the man at the center of the room. This was the moment they had all come for, the lion at the peak of his power, acclaiming his queen in front of the most dangerous audience on the planet. His voice carried across the ballroom the way it always did, not loud, but inescapable. The voice of a man who has never once had to repeat himself. "To my queen," he said, his eyes locked on Isabella. "And to an empire that will never fall." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and produced the velvet box. The room leaned in collectively. Somewhere near the back, a camera flashed. And then the first second ticked. The massive digital screens behind the grand staircase, which had been displaying a slow, golden animation of Lorenzo and Isabella's intertwined initials all evening, violently glitched. The gold dissolved into blinding, chaotic static. A high-pitched feedback screech tore through the sound system so suddenly and so savagely that hardened cartel bosses dropped their drinks. Men who had sat calmly through gunfights physically recoiled from the noise. Then the static cleared, and what replaced it on those screens stopped the room cold. Crystal clear, high-definition satellite footage. Live. Lorenzo's eastern shipping ports. The ones he had bled 3 rival families to acquire just 6 months ago. The ones that were supposed to be the impenetrable foundation of his new global empire, were erupting in massive synchronized fireballs, one after another, methodical, deliberate, not an accident, not a rival taking a shot in the dark. A coordinated surgical demolition executed simultaneously across every single port in the network. His entire Eastern operation, gone. Peak in seconds. Second 2. Lorenzo's eyes snapped from the screen back to Isabella. She hadn't moved. She hadn't flinched at the explosions, hadn't gasped with the rest of the room, hadn't reached for him the way a frightened fiancé would have. The trembling vulnerability she had shown at the gilded mirror, gone. Completely and instantly replaced by something else entirely. A stillness, a coldness, a smile so calm and so calculated that it stopped Lorenzo's blood in his veins. She took one slow, deliberate step backward, away from him. The velvet box was still in Lorenzo's hand when the waiter moved, the one with the scarred knuckles and the tight tuxedo, and the catalogued knowledge of every blind spot in the room. He crossed the distance to Lorenzo's head of security in 4 steps. Smooth, unhesitating, out invisible in the chaos of the screaming screens. A concealed blade produced from nowhere drove cleanly into the bodyguard's neck. The man dropped without a sound. The velvet box hit the marble and the ring rolled free, spinning across the floor and coming to rest in a slowly spreading pool of blood. Forgotten. Irrelevant. Nobody was looking at the ring anymore. 3rd second. The massive oak doors of the ballroom, reinforced, thick enough to absorb a battering ram locked from the outside by Lorenzo's own security protocol, were blown completely off their hinges by a concussive blast that shook the entire building to its foundation. Every imported white orchid in the room was stripped from the walls. Every remaining crystal window shattered inward in a glittering explosion of glass. The shockwave rolled through the room like a physical force, sending guests sprawling across the marble. Through the billowing smoke and the screaming and the blinding chaos of tactical flashbangs, a dozen heavily armed operatives poured through the ruined doorway. Precise, coordinated, unstoppable, and through all of it, the explosions on the screens, the dying bodyguard, the blasted doors, the flooding smoke. Isabella Vance stood perfectly, impossibly still. She reached into her designer clutch with one hand. What she removed was not a phone, not a compact, not anything a society wedding guest should have been carrying onto a private island fortress. It was a pistol, suppressed, gold-plated, and it was aimed without a single tremor directly at Lorenzo's chest. The room fell into a stunned, paralyzed silence broken only by the distant roar of his burning ports and the sound of tactical boots on shattered marble. Isabella's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. And yet somehow, impossibly, every single person in that ballroom heard every single word. "You took my father's empire 6 months ago, Lorenzo." A beat. The pistol didn't waver by a millimeter. "So I decided to take your entire world." The most powerful man in the criminal underworld stood in the ruins of his own engagement party, his empire burning on the screens behind him, his security bleeding out on the marble in front of him, and the woman he had chosen as a business acquisition holding a gun to his heart. The untouchable billionaire had just been touched, and the night was far from over. The echo of the blast hadn't even faded before the grand ballroom descended into pure, primal anarchy. The world's most feared kingpins were on their knees behind overturned tables. Corrupt senators were crawling on their hands and knees across shattered crystal and trampled white orchids, their $100,000 suits soaked through with spilled champagne and blood. The string quartet stage collapsed under the weight of stampeding guests, clawing desperately toward the emergency exits, only to find every single one of them sealed shut, magnetically locked from the outside. Isabella's mercenary squad had been thorough. There was nowhere to run. The island itself had become the trap. And in the center of all of it, Lorenzo. He moved before the dust had settled, before the ringing in the room's ears had cleared, and before most of the guests had even fully processed what was happening around them. Because whatever else Lorenzo the Lion Rossi was, whatever crime sat on his conscience, whatever blood was on his hands, the man had survived things that should have killed him a dozen times over. Survival wasn't something he had to think about. It was something older and deeper than thought. With a furious, earth-shattering roar that cut clean through the gunfire and the screaming, he grabbed the edge of the nearest banquet table, solid oak, 12 feet long, hundreds of pounds, and hurled it onto its side with one heave. It hit the marble with a crash that sent crystal and silverware exploding in every direction. A makeshift barricade. Crude, immediate, sufficient. And he was behind it before the first suppressed round shredded the air where he had been standing a half-second before. His remaining loyal security detail, 4 men, 2 of them already bleeding, swarmed to his position, weapons drawn, bodies low, forming a desperate human shield in the center of the crossfire. The tactical smoke was thickening. The flashbangs had done their work, and the room was a disorienting, blinding, deafening nightmare of smoke and strobing light, and the muffled percussion of suppressed weapons firing from every direction. Lorenzo pressed his back against the splintered edge of the overturned table and breathed. One breath, controlled, deliberate. The same breath he had taken 6 months ago in the moment before he gave the order that dismantled 3 rival families in a single night. And the breath that meant he had switched something off inside himself, something human, and switched something else on entirely. His eyes moved through the smoke. He found her. Of course he found her. Because Isabella wasn't hiding. She wasn't crouched behind cover, barking orders through a radio, directing her operatives from a position of safety the way a tactician should have been. She was moving through the crossfire, calmly, almost leisurely, completely surrounded by her tactical team, yes, but not sheltered by them. Walking through the chaos she had engineered as though it were a gallery opening, and every burning, screaming, bleeding thing around her was simply part of the exhibition. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't afraid. And as the smoke shifted and she turned her head and found Lorenzo's eyes through the haze, she smiled. Not the practiced, camera-ready smile from earlier in the evening. Something else entirely. Something private and cold and deeply satisfied. The smile of a woman who has spent 6 months building a machine and is now watching it run exactly as designed. Lorenzo's jaw tightened until the muscles in his face stood out like cables under tension. He had built his entire empire on the ability to read people, to see through performance, through pretense, through the elaborate theater that the powerful use to disguise their intentions. He had looked at Isabella Vance and seen a transaction, a strategic asset. A woman smart enough to understand the value of what he was offering and ambitious enough to want it. He had been wrong. Not about her intelligence, not about her ambition, about the direction it was pointed. His lieutenant's voice cut through the noise, low and urgent, pressed close against his ear. "Boss, we need to move. Right now. They've got the exits, but the dock on the north side. The ghost boat. It's not on any layout they could have accessed. If we go now, through the kitchen corridor." Another burst of fire chewed through the top of their barricade, raining splinters down on both of them. Lorenzo didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still on Isabella through the smoke, watching her direct 2 of her operatives toward the room's security station, toward the server that housed his encrypted communications network. She wasn't just taking the island. She was taking everything on it. "Lorenzo, we have to go." Lorenzo pulled his gaze from Isabella. The look on his face was something his lieutenant had never seen there before in 15 years of service. Something raw and volcanic and deeply, dangerously personal. "Get me off this island." His voice was completely level, quiet in a way that was far more frightening than shouting. "And get word to the families, every one of them, tonight." "What do I tell them?" Lorenzo took one last look at his burning empire on the screens above. at the shattered marble and the trampled orchids and the guests of his engagement party bleeding and cowering across the floor of what was supposed to be the greatest night of his life. "Tell them the lion is still breathing," he said, "and tell them I want her head." He turned and moved, low and fast, toward the kitchen corridor. His 2 remaining bodyguards folded around him like a broken wing trying to shield a wound. Behind them, Isabella watched him go. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She had already won tonight. She was simply allowing him to leave. Because a wounded lion running for his life was far more useful to her than a dead one rotting on her new island. For now. By the time the ghost boat cleared the island's northern perimeter and dissolved into the dark of the open Mediterranean, the gunfire had stopped. The screaming had stopped. The only sounds left on the island were the low crackle of distant fires, the crunch of tactical boots moving through debris, and the quiet, efficient voices of Isabella's team securing every room, every server, every asset that Lorenzo Rossi had spent a lifetime building. The smoke cleared over the Mediterranean fortress just before dawn. The grand ballroom, which just hours ago had been the most opulent room in the criminal world, a cathedral of imported orchids and crystal and uncounted wealth, was now a ruin. Overturned tables, shattered chandeliers, the remnants of a champagne fountain lying in pieces across blood-stained marble. And somewhere beneath the debris, still caught in the draft from the blown-out doors, the ring. Forgotten. Unclaimed. Irrelevant. The engagement was over. And so was Lorenzo Rossi's world. In the span of 3 seconds, 3 single, irreversible, catastrophic seconds, the most anticipated union in criminal history had been transformed into the most devastating hostile takeover the underworld had ever witnessed. This wasn't a betrayal. Betrayal implies impulsiveness, one emotion, a moment of reactive fury. What Isabella Vance had executed in that ballroom was none of those things. It was architecture. 6 months of silent, meticulous, breathtakingly patient construction, built in the shadow of the man who thought he was using her, detonated at the precise moment of maximum impact. She hadn't crashed the engagement party. She had designed it. Every guest, every seating arrangement, every security blind spot her undercover operative had catalogued from behind his silver tray. The ballroom wasn't the scene of her revenge, it was the stage for it. And now, as the first pale light of morning touched the Mediterranean, Isabella stood on the terrace of what had been Lorenzo's private compound and looked out at the water. Her water now. By sunrise, the transfers had already begun. Lorenzo's eastern shipping ports, the ones still standing after the night's coordinated demolition, the ones that remained structurally viable and operationally essential, were being quietly, legally, and irrevocably signed over through a network of shell companies that Isabella's legal team had been constructing for the better part of a year. His European distribution lines followed. His encrypted client lists, pulled directly from the island server by her operatives in the final minutes of the firefight, were already being analyzed by her people in 3 cities simultaneously. And then there were the families, the surviving underbosses, the cartel representatives, the syndicate delegates who had arrived on this island expecting to toast the most powerful couple in the underworld and had instead spent the night bleeding on marble and hiding behind overturned furniture. They made their calculations quickly. They were practical men and women who had built careers on the ability to read a room, and the room they had just survived had delivered a message so clear and so total that there was nothing left to interpret. Lorenzo Rossi was gone, running, bleeding, stripped of every asset, every port, every line of distribution, every encrypted contact that formed the machinery of his empire. Isabella Vance was standing on his island, in his compound, holding his empire in her hands without having broken a sweat. The math was not complicated. One by one, through the early morning hours, the messages came in. Acknowledgements, pledges, carefully worded declarations of realignment from men who an evening ago had raised their glasses to Lorenzo's untouchable dynasty. They weren't pledging loyalty out of admiration. They were pledging it out of the only language the criminal world has ever truly understood: the recognition of superior power. Isabella read each message, set it aside, and moved on to the next. She had not slept. She did not appear to need to. By mid-morning, her chief of staff laid the final communication on the table in front of her, a confirmed report from her operatives tracking the ghost boat that had slipped away from the island's north dock in the early hours. Lorenzo had made it to open water. He was alive, untrackable, and moving. Isabella looked at the report for a long moment. Then she set it down and returned to the window. Because here is the thing about Isabella Vance that every person who had underestimated her, starting with her own father's enemies and ending spectacularly with Lorenzo Rossi, had failed to understand until it was far too late. She had not spent 6 months planning a single night. She had spent 6 months planning everything that came after it. Lorenzo escaping the island was not an oversight. It was not a loose end. It was a calculated decision. A dead Lorenzo was a closed chapter, grieved by some, avenged by others, and eventually forgotten by a criminal world that moves on as efficiently as any other market. A living Lorenzo, stripped of his empire, humiliated in front of every figure of consequence in the underworld, keen hunted and desperate in the shadows he once ruled. That was something far more valuable. That was a warning, permanent and breathing. The new empress had arrived, and she had left the lion alive specifically so that every person in the criminal world could watch what happened to the most powerful man they knew when he crossed the wrong woman. But power, as Isabella understood better than anyone, is never truly static. It shifts. It breathes. It finds pressure points and exploits them with the same cold patience she had used to build this night. She had learned that lesson from her father, watching his empire crumble under Lorenzo's coordinated strikes 6 months ago. She had learned it again, building her own operation in the ruins of that loss. And she knew, with the same certainty that had carried her through every step of this, that somewhere out on that dark water, Lorenzo the Lion Rossi was learning it too. He was wounded. He was furious. He was backed into a corner with nothing left to lose and everything imaginable to prove. And every seasoned predator in the world knows the same truth about a wounded lion. It is not the lion at the height of its power that you need to fear. It is the one with nothing left to lose. And there it is. From the champagne fountain to the burning ports. From a ring rolling across blood-stained marble to a new empress standing on a stolen throne at sunrise. 1 night, 3 seconds. An entire criminal empire transferred from one pair of hands to another with the cold, breathtaking precision of a master class in long-game vengeance. But if you have been paying attention, and I think you have, you already know that this story is nowhere close to finished. Isabella Vance is brilliant, she is patient, and she is ruthless, and she has just pulled off the most audacious power grab in the history of the modern underworld. But brilliance has never made anyone bulletproof, and patience, as Lorenzo himself once understood better than anyone, cuts both ways. He is out there right now, somewhere in the dark, on an untrackable boat with a murderous vow and absolutely nothing left to lose. No ports, no distribution lines, no encrypted network, no empire, no throne, just rage, pure, focused, and personal. In the criminal world, a man with nothing left to lose is not a defeated man. He is the most dangerous version of himself that has ever existed. So the question is not whether Lorenzo strikes back. It is when, it is how, and it is who is left standing when he does. If this episode gripped you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single update as this war between the lion and the new empress unfolds. Drop your theories about Lorenzo's next move in the comments below. I read every single one. And in our next episode, we are going inside the most heavily guarded secret of one of the most notorious cartel kingpins alive today. A secret so explosive that people have already paid with their lives simply for knowing it existed. You do not want to miss it.